Hello and welcome, dear students. Today we are going to discuss about adrenal gland, its structure, secretion and functions. The main objectives of today's lecture are to get a brief idea about adrenal gland, followed by a detailed account of the structure of the adrenal gland. We will also describe the secretions released by this gland, and then finally we will discuss their functions in general. So, to begin with, let us first discuss the adrenal gland. The adrenal glands, also known as suprarenal glands, are associated with the superior aspect of each kidney as depicted in the figure. However, each adrenal gland has a different shape in relation to the other. The glands have an inner and an outer region, each with its own individual controls and secretions. So, they can be thought of as a gland within a gland. The glands are retroperitoneal, that is, they are covered in perinephric fat. However, there is a thin septum which separates each gland from its associated kidney. Now, we will discuss the structure of the adrenal glands. As we know that there are two adrenal glands located one on each kidney. The adrenal gland on the right kidney is said to be the right adrenal gland, and similarly the one located on left is said to be the left adrenal gland. The right adrenal gland is shaped like a pyramid and the left adrenal gland is crescent shaped and is larger of the pair. Histologically, the adrenal gland consists of two distinct regions, namely adrenal cortex and adrenal medulla. The adrenal cortex is located peripherally and comprises of 80 to 90% of the gland, while as adrenal medulla is small and is located centrally. Now, we have learned that adrenal glands comprise of adrenal cortex and adrenal medulla, but there arises a question: what actually adrenal cortex and adrenal medulla is comprised of? The adrenal cortex consists of three zones. The outer zone is called the zona glomerulosa, the middle zone is called the zona fasciculata, and the inner zone is called the zona reticularis. It should be noted that each zone secretes different hormones as shown in the figure. Now, the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla is the inner region of the adrenal gland. It is a modified sympathetic ganglion of the autonomous nervous system. It develops from the same embryonic tissue as all other sympathetic ganglia, but its cells lack axons and form clusters around large blood vessels. Rather than releasing a neurotransmitter, the cells of the adrenal medulla secrete hormones. Adrenal medulla is comprised of hormone-producing cells called chromaffin cells. The chromaffin cells of the adrenal medulla secrete an unequal amount of two hormones, namely epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are also known as adrenaline and noradrenaline respectively. Now, we will describe the hormones secreted by the adrenal glands. So, let us begin with the hormones of the adrenal cortex. As we described earlier, that adrenal cortex consists of three zones and that each zone secretes different hormones. The outer zone of the adrenal cortex secretes a hormone, namely mineralocorticoids. They are named so because they affect mineral homeostasis. The middle zone, which is widest of the three zones, mainly secrete glucocorticoids. The glucocorticoids have gained their name because they exhibit important effects that increase blood glucose concentration. They have an additional effect on both the protein and fat metabolism that are equally as important to the body function as their effects on carbohydrate metabolism. The cells of the inner zone synthesize small amounts of weak androgens, which are steroid hormones, having masculinizing effects. It may be noted that more than 30 steroids have been isolated from the adrenal cortex, but two are of exceptional importance to the normal endocrine function of the human body. They are aldosterone and cortisol. Aldosterone is the principal mineralocorticoid, while as cortisol is the principal glucocorticoid. It should be noted that complete loss of adrenocortical hormone leads to the death due to dehydration and electrolyte imbalances in a few days to a week, unless hormone replacement therapy begins promptly. Now, hormones of the adrenal medulla. As described earlier, the adrenal medulla secretes two hormones, namely noradrenaline and adrenaline. Both of these are catecholamines, as shown in figure. About 80% of the catecholamines released from the adrenal glands is adrenaline. These catecholamines are released in response to stress, in that they prepare the body for fight or flight, and that is why they are also called fight and flight hormones. It should be noted that catecholamines exert their effects over a shorter time course. Now, we know that what are adrenal glands, what they comprise of, and what hormones they secrete. We will now understand the functions of these hormones. Firstly, let us begin with the functions of the hormones secreted by the adrenal cortex. As we are well aware that adrenal cortex secretes three groups of steroid hormones, namely mineralocorticoids, glucocorticoids, androgens. We will now discuss the mineralocorticoids and its functions. Aldosterone is the major mineralocorticoid. It regulates homeostasis of two mineral ions, namely sodium ion and potassium ion, and helps adjust blood pressure and blood volume. Aldosterone also promotes excretion of hydrogen ions in the urine. This removal of acids from the body can help prevent acidosis. The secretion of the aldosterone is under the control of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone, or we can say RAA pathway. The stimuli that initiate this pathway include dehydration, sodium ion deficiency, or hemorrhage. These conditions cause a decrease in blood volume. This decreased blood volume then leads to a decreased blood pressure, which stimulates certain cells of the kidneys to secrete an enzyme called renin. As the level of the renin in the blood increases, it then converts a plasma protein produced by the liver called angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1. Now, as the increased levels of angiotensin 1 circulates in the body, an angiotensin converting enzyme converts angiotensin 1 into the hormone angiotensin 2. Therefore, resulting in an increase of angiotensin 2 levels in blood. It then stimulates the adrenal cortex to secrete aldosterone. Now, the blood containing increased levels of aldosterone circulates to the kidneys, where it causes reabsorption of water by a process called osmosis, as a result of which less water is lost in the urine. Further, aldosterone also stimulates the kidneys to increase secretion of potassium and hydrogen ions into the urine. Besides angiotensin 2, a second stimulator of aldosterone secretion is an increase in the potassium ion concentration of blood or intestinal fluid. It should be noted here that a decrease in the blood calcium level has the opposite effect. Now, coming to the other hormones of the adrenal cortex, that is glucocorticoids. The glucocorticoids include cortisol, also called hydrocortisone, corticosterone and cortisone. Of these three hormones secreted by the zona fasciculata, cortisol is the most abundant, accounting for about 95% of the glucocorticoid activity. Control of glucocorticoid secretion occurs via a typical negative feedback system as depicted in the figure. Low blood levels of glucocorticoids, mainly cortisol, stimulate neurosecretory cells in the hypothalamus to secrete corticotrophin releasing hormone. Corticotrophin releasing hormone together with a low level of cortisol promote the release of adrenocorticotrophin releasing hormone from the anterior pituitary. The ACTH flows in the blood to the adrenal cortex, where it stimulates glucocorticoid secretion. To a much smaller extent, ACTH also stimulates secretion of aldosterone. Now, we will discuss the effects of glucocorticoids on body. Number 1. Protein breakdown. Glucocorticoids increase the rate of protein breakdown, mainly in muscle fibers, and thus increase the liberation of amino acids into the bloodstream. These amino acids then may be used by body cells for synthesis of new proteins or for ATP production. Second effect of glucocorticoid is glucose formation. On stimulation by glucocorticoids, liver cells may convert certain amino acids or lactic acid to glucose, which neurons and other cells can use for ATP production. Such conversion of a substance other than glycogen or another monosaccharide into the glucose is called gluconeogenesis. Now, the third effect includes lipolysis. Glucocorticoids stimulate lipolysis, which is the breakdown of triglycerides and release of fatty acids from adipose tissue into the blood. Another effect includes resistance to stress. Glucocorticoids work in many ways to provide resistance to stress. The additional glucose supplied by the liver cells provides tissues with a ready source of ATP to combat a range of stresses, including exercise, fasting, fright, temperature extremes, high altitude, etc. Because glucocorticoids make blood vessels more sensitive to other hormones that cause vasoconstriction, they raise blood pressure. This effect would be an advantage in cases of severe blood loss, which causes blood pressure to drop. Fifth effect being anti-inflammatory effects. Glucocorticoids inhibit white blood cells that participate in inflammatory responses. Unfortunately, glucocorticoids also retard tissue repair, and as a result, they slow wound healing, although high doses can cause severe mental disturbances. Glucocorticoids are very useful in the treatment of chronic inflammatory disorders such as rheumatoid arthritis. Now, the effects of glucocorticoid on depression of immune responses. High doses of glucocorticoids depress immune responses. For this reason, glucocorticoids are prescribed for organ transplant recipients to retard tissue rejection by the immune system. Now, we discuss the functions of cortisol. Physical and psychological stressors, for example, trauma, hemorrhage, fever, increased ACTH and cortisol secretion, which in turn regulate the metabolic adaptations to these stimuli. This effect is very important, and cortisol deficiency can rapidly become life-threatening under stressful conditions. The response to stress is called the general adaptation syndrome, and it is divided into 3 phases. Phase 1 is alarm reaction. In this, a stressful stimulus causes noradrenaline release from sympathetic nerves, adrenaline and non-adrenaline release from the adrenal medulla, also cortisol release from the adrenal cortex. Phase 2 is resistance. In this phase, the effects of cortisol are slower to initiate as they are dependent on transcription. However, they are longer lasting than those of adrenaline and noradrenaline. This allows the resistance to stress to be maintained. It also counteracts the effects of other hormones, for example, insulin, to maintain substrates required to combat stress. Phase 3 is exhaustion. Prolonged stress causes continued cortisol secretion, and it results in muscle wastage, immune system suppression, and hyperglycemia. Cortisol affects almost every cell in the body. The physiological effects are described in figure. The main actions of cortisol are increase of energy metabolite levels in the blood, suppression of the immune system, and inhibition of the allergic and inflammatory responses. There is some overlap between the actions of mineralocorticoids and glucocorticoids. Cortisol can have mineralocorticoid actions and aldosterone can act as a glucocorticoid. Now, we will learn about the third hormone of the adrenal cortex, that is the androgens. The androgens are the steroid hormones that are involved in the growth and function of the male and female genital tract. They also stimulate muscle growth. Androgens are made in the adrenal gland in both males and females. However, in males, they account for only a small proportion of total androgen production. Now, moving to the functions of the hormones secreted by the adrenal medulla. The two major hormones synthesized by the adrenal medulla are epinephrine and norepinephrine, also called adrenaline or noradrenaline respectively. Noradrenaline is synthesized from the amino acid tyrosine, which is then converted to adrenaline in response to cortisol from the adrenal cortex. The medullary cells store catecholamines in the cytoplasmic granules. They are released into the blood sinusoids by exocytosis in response to acetylcholine from the preganglionic sympathetic neurons. The chromaffin cells of the adrenal medulla secrete an unequal amount of these hormones, about 80% of epinephrine and 20% norepinephrine. The hormones of the adrenal medulla intensify sympathetic responses that occur in other parts of the body. In stressful situations and during exercise, impulses from the hypothalamus stimulate sympathetic preganglionic neurons, which in turn stimulate the chromaffin cells to secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine. These two hormones greatly augment the fight or flight response. By increasing heart rate and force of contraction, epinephrine and norepinephrine increase the output of the heart, which increases blood pressure. They also increase blood flow to the heart, liver, skeletal muscles and adipose tissues, dilate airways to the lungs and increase blood levels of glucose and fatty acids. Dear students, it was all about today's lecture. Hope you have understood it well. Thank you and goodbye.